Good afternoon, and I too would like to welcome you to the City Club of Cleveland. I am Barbara Danforth, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of the Board of the City Club. Today we will be talking about the intersection of place, geography, health, wealth, and opportunity. This is an intersection that is the subject of a growing body of research. Here at the City Club, we recently have hosted several influential thinkers on this topic, including Ta-Nehisi Coates of The Atlantic, and just last week, Richard Rothstein of the Economic Policy Institute. Both speakers had provocative messages that challenged conventional explanations of the causes of urban and suburban segregation and the economic disparities that segregation has created. Today we are bringing the conversation a little closer to home. In the 1920s, community development was built around racial and ethnic enclaves, and real estate agents, banks, and insurance companies and others, including the federal government, actively promoted segregated neighborhoods. Race became the determining and organizing factor for the real estate industry, a practice that remained in force decades after its inception. In 2014, the Cuyahoga County PlaceMatters team commissioned a report to examine the roles of policy, race, real estate, and their effect on health equity and opportunity in Cuyahoga County. Today you will hear the results of that report and hear from leaders on the importance of these historic real estate policies and their implications for Cuyahoga County's contemporary development issues. Our program today is a little different from our standard forum. First, we will hear about the report. Then, Rick Jackson of IdeaStream will moderate a panel discussion to help us better understand the report findings and the implications. And finally, we will have our traditional City Club questions and answers. Here to present the report is lead author Jason Reece, Director of Research for the Kirwin Institute for Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Mr. Reece formerly was the director of the Opportunity Communities program and has worked for the Kirwin Institute since 2003. His work involves outreach, education, advocacy, and policy research on issues relating to fair housing or opportunity-based housing, community development, neighborhood revitalization, regional equity, and geographic information systems. He co-developed the methodology for opportunity mapping with John A. Powell, Executive Director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, a methodology which has been adopted and utilized by more than 24 nonprofit and philanthropic partners and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, I present to you Jason Reece, Director of Research for the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University.
Good afternoon. So I would like to start out today with a thank you. I get the pleasure of presenting this work today, but really this was a collective effort. And I want to say thank you to the entire PlaceMatters team who contribute so much of their time and energy into the research and into the report in meeting with us multiple times over the past year as we've had this really productive partnership. I want to acknowledge Matt Martin, who is one of our co-authors on the report with the Kirwin Institute, and any of the tough questions I can't answer, I will point you in his direction. So, sorry, Matt. I'm going to start out today with a contemporary issue that we're dealing with here in our state. And it's an issue that resonates here locally as well. So the map that I have up right now demonstrates the infant mortality hotspots, as we call them. What those really are those concentrations of poor infant health outcomes in Cuyahoga County. So the dark red areas there, those are areas where we see 10 to 16 infant deaths per square mile over a several year period. Now, how do we think about this issue? So one of the things that we have learned over the years through the work of the PlaceMatters team, national experts like Brian Smedley, who's going to talk today, is that place matters in understanding this very broad issue of infant mortality, and that there's a geographic component, and we see that in the map, but also that there's a component of this which is tied to community and tied to the condition or the stressors within those communities. Therefore, the solution to address some of these issues are community-based solutions. We also learned through the work of the PlaceMatters team that race, class, equity all play into this issue of health disparities. Our health risks are not evenly distributed, and the burden borne by certain communities is much greater than others. My talk today is to build upon the earlier learning and to suggest to you that history also matters, that we can't effectively address some of these issues today without a clear understanding of how we got to where we are. So I'm going to start with my question of why. So why do this? And to quote one of my favorite Mark Twain quotes, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. There's a lot that we can learn from the patterns, practices, and policies of the way we shaped and built cities in the past. And I'm going to argue today that actually to effectively look forward, we have to understand the past and understand what drove our communities to be in the conditions that they are today, some of which are bastions of opportunity, some of which deal with multiple challenges, ranging from health to economics and finance to housing or blight. So the first point that I want to make today is that when you drive around this city or any city that you're in, any neighborhood, there's nothing natural about that built environment. That built environment is the product of layer upon layer of policy and action. Investment strategies, decisions about where infrastructure will go, deciding which neighborhoods could get loans and couldn't get loans, deciding where critical resources and opportunities like schools are going to go, the impacts of road projects. All of this manifests itself in what we see in the city today. And so when we look at neighborhoods that are facing extreme challenges, we have to understand that they didn't naturally become this way. And in fact, in many ways, they were designed to fail. And the conditions we see today are the result of policies that really set neighborhoods up to struggle in the long term. I try to get this pointer to work here. We'll see. Okay. The other piece of this story, which is important, and many of you which were here for some of the earlier sessions are on this topic, know that race definitely plays a role in the way cities developed, in the way our neighborhoods grew, and in terms of who could live where. And what I'm going to suggest, though, is that race not only played a role, but that race and racial exclusion and ethnic exclusion, and in some cases class-based exclusion, were fundamental, foundational elements of our development policies of the 20th century. Again, this notion of layer upon layer of policies which were intended and designed to keep people separated from each other, to benefit some neighborhoods at the expense of other neighborhoods. And again, this is by design. So there are a lot of policies that we could talk about today, and I have a limited set of slides and time to go through all of my materials. But what I want to suggest to you is that this is a long-term challenge, whether we're talking about redlining or the racial aspects of zoning and restrictive covenants, to urban renewal and highway programs, to other factors in the real estate industry such as racial steering, editorializing, or even racial harassment. Today I'm going to focus on two of these issues, though, which were profoundly important in shaping the city and shaping its many neighborhoods. And the first is to think about the role of planning and development, and particularly land use policy. Something we don't often think about when we start to think about race relations, but a fundamentally important aspect of who could live where and the conditions in which folks could live. I'm going to start this story actually by leaving Cleveland and going to the city of Baltimore in 1910. I'm a planning professor. I also teach at OSU. I was a practicing city planner at some time, so part of this for me is this cathartic experience of pointing out the flaws of my own field. So zoning was a very early invention of the 20th century, and it only took a few years before zoning was twisted to support these kind of more nefarious roles of real social engineering. And Baltimore would be the first city to do this when they enacted a racial zoning ordinance, either in 1910 or 1911, depending on the historians that you talk to. The justification for this was that, in this case, African Americans were viewed as this invasive threat, that they were actually a public health risk, and that they needed to be contained. You know, similar thinking that you might associate more with the Jewish ghettos of prior to the Holocaust in Germany. This was very dominant thinking of this time period of the way we should plan for and zone for our cities. So racial zoning would take off in cities across the country, particularly in the South, also in the West Coast. In Ohio, we didn't necessarily embrace racial zoning, but the tenets of racial zoning and this philosophy of using land use policies to keep people separated definitely took hold. In 1917, the Supreme Court strikes down racial zoning as unconstitutional. Very logical that they would do this. And some folks, from a historical perspective, say, okay, here's that weird aberration where we zoned cities by race. That's taken care of. We don't have to talk about that anymore. What really happened, though, was that the system evolved. In immediate response to the end of racial zoning in Baltimore, the city administration and the real estate industry sat down and constructed a strategy of using restrictive covenants to the most of their ability. And those not familiar with covenants, these are private amendments added to deeds of property so that folks cannot transfer those properties to people of a different race, religion, ethnicity. And they began to see these covenants as a more effective strategy and also one that they could constitutionally defend. And the courts helped them in that the Supreme Court justified the use of covenants in 1926. So covenants in particular would take off in our cities here in Ohio. If we were to think about this time period too, we have to understand that this is one of those periods where we see a dramatic shift in the demographics of our cities. Cleveland is not an exception to this. Lots of immigration from Europe still, primarily Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Also then, this is one of the first major waves of African Americans coming up from the Jim Crow South, coming to these rich industrial job centers here in the North. And an uncomfortable situation to some degree where we had policymakers at that time who openly adopted and embraced these kind of racist ideologies of who should live next to who, but a significant business interest to bring in all these folks because we needed the labor for industry that drove the economies of these cities. So here in Ohio, we have some research just about the aggressiveness of covenants. And I'll start with a story down in Columbus where there's been probably the only really exhaustive study of the use of covenants. And they found that basically between 1920 and 1935, before the market really fell apart during the Depression, about 2/3 of all the subdivisions platted in Columbus at this time were racially restricted. Here in Cleveland, It's early as 1914, the NAACP noted that there was an unusual tendency here to start to adopt these binding agreements onto real estate transactions, and that they were targeted, to quote the NAACP in 1914, to block the transfer of property to colored people, Jews, and foreigners generally. So also another important note here is that during this time period, our definition of who was to be excluded was very wide. Ethnic Europeans definitely fell into that, the Jewish population fell into that, and the African American population fell into this category. If we were on the West Coast, we'd be talking about Asian immigrants who were heavily restricted during this time period in those cities. A couple examples here from marketing in the 1920s of just the role of covenants and how open communities were in regards to covenants. And these come from Shaker Heights. I'm going to quote you an advertisement from the Forest Hill subdivision from the developers of that, where they note that if you buy a home in this neighborhood, your neighbors are inevitably the people of tastes in common with yours. The careful restriction placed on Forest Hill will never be lowered. So what was hidden within that was that word restriction. And everybody knew at that who you're restricting and what they're talking about there, right? Shaker was unique in that they had a somewhat different strategy than a lot of communities where they basically used sales agreements where your neighbors had to agree or the community organization had to agree to sales as a measure of controlling who moved in and out. So this required some marketing and community organizing to assure that folks bought into these covenants. And so just again, another quote from the Shaker Protective Association of 1925. The ever-present menace to every resident of Shaker Village and throughout Cleveland, unless a street is 100% signed up for restrictions, the danger of an undesirable neighbor is an ever-present one. And we, again, know who they're talking about when they talk about this undesirable neighbor that they want to keep out. Now, covenants were only one part of the picture. Of course, what happens at this time, and if I had an hour to talk to you, we'd talk about the build-out of suburbia, the fact that the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, would only lend for new suburbs that remained segregated, the large infrastructure investments that were made in the growth of suburbia, and the role of suburbia to some degree in creating the modern definition of who's white in America. This was the first time after World War II that these white ethnics began to move in together and merge together, and their ethnic identities began to fall apart. But they do this in this new suburban space, a space that is not open to African Americans. So between 1930 and 1960, which was the peak suburb building years here in the US, less than 1% of African Americans could get a mortgage. Also then at the same time, we did a fairly effective job of demolishing much of our inner city areas through urban renewal, highway programs, and some of the devastation that was wrought from those policies. So that's also part of this story. Now, this would all shift in the 1960s. And we had to deal with both crisis, even the local incidences here of backlash from the community, dealing with, at this point, decades of segregation, of racial prejudice, of intolerance. Also then, extreme activism. And of course, the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. 1968, we get the first Fair Housing Act on the eve of Martin Luther King's assassination. And things begin to change. And we get also here in Cleveland, in kind of a very small scale effort at least, but an important effort to support kind of a pro-integration agenda. And unfortunately, again, due to the time restrictions, I can't give kudos to all the different efforts and actions here in Cuyahoga County, probably involving some of you in the room or organizations you work for, but definitely a very positive time period in terms of promoting civil rights. What I want to talk about next, though, is another piece of that story. So the civil rights movement really pushed on fair housing, and rightfully so. But what we didn't adequately address was the credit side of this situation, the role of capital, the role of investment. And this failure to deal with the issue of credit and the issue of investment created more challenges down the road for many of these same neighborhoods that had been segregated for decades, if not most of the 20th century. So any of you who were here for the last summer's discussion about the case for reparations know the backstory on redlining, so I won't dive into that in great detail. But what I want to note is just some of the fundamentals of redlining for those of you who are not aware, and some of the backstory. Redlining was in some ways very rational at this time period. Redlining was instituted in the 1930s, supported by the federal government, implemented by HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, involved assessments neighborhood by neighborhood of about 239 cities across the U.S. All very rational things to do, considering the federal government in the aftermath of the Great Depression was about to interject itself heavily into the housing market. The FHA was about to be created. The secondary housing market was about to emerge. A whole host of new housing programs were going to come in the aftermath of the Depression and World War II. And so the federal government needed some type of guiding light to help them make investment decisions because so many loans had defaulted during the Depression. And so what folks who did assessments did was they graded neighborhoods into 4 categories. And Cleveland actually had 2 of these assessments done, one done for the city in the early part of the 1930s, a more cohesive one done in 1940 for the entire county, and this is the one we focus on today. The term redlining then comes from neighborhoods that were graded D, or sometimes labeled as hazardous, by real estate appraisers of that time period. So what we did with this project was to take that story, that history, which is always told in generalities, and get more specific. And we were aided to some degree by a recent uncovery in which OSU's libraries basically came across all of the original assessor documents. Those actual assessors, what their handwritten notes about these different neighborhoods and what they took into account. And the results of that are pretty jarring. And it's a must-read. It's an infuriating read, but it's a must-read. So sorry, in tiny font that nobody can read on this screen. I've actually got you a screenshot of one of these assessments. And again, for those not familiar with the redlining maps, the 4 tiers, which I'll point out here on the map, are green, top-graded areas, blue are second-graded areas. These areas would generally be backed by the federal government for lending purposes. Yellow areas would get 15% federal backing. Generally, banks wouldn't touch them. The red areas received no federal backing, so mainstream lenders would not, again, touch these neighborhoods. And there's a lot of stuff that you would expect to find in a real estate assessment, right? What do the properties look like? How many single family versus rental? What's the roads and parks and amenities look like? But then you dig a little bit deeper, and you start to see how much attention in these assessments are really put forth around who lives here and who's desirable and undesirable. In fact, the traditional assessment form had a column noting infiltration. Infiltration is not a word you use to note that you're happy about somebody coming into the neighborhood, right? And this was actually done by design on the forms. And so this is very typical of one of the assessments here where the assessor notes, strong colored infiltration, also Jewish and Italian. So when you read all the assessment and you read all the data put together, that line usually dictated what happened to the neighborhood. If it was an ethnic European neighborhood, it would get graded yellow. If there were races mixing together, again, kind of a nightmare scenario, it would get graded yellow. If it was an African-American neighborhood, it would instantly be graded red. Even if those African-American neighborhoods were some of our stronger African-American neighborhoods in these cities. Many of these were bastions for the upper and middle class, but they were still deemed as hazardous for investment. And again, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So a real estate assessor looks at this neighborhood and says, well, obviously we have African Americans, we have Jewish people, we have Italians living here mixing together. The future for this neighborhood is bleak, and just as they state here in their written notes, the apparent future for this area will be an increasing occupancy ratio by Jewish, Italian, and colored with a steady fall in price value. That then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they say, well, this is hazardous for investment. We're not going to make loans in this neighborhood. Now, these maps would resonate for upwards of 40 years after they were made, influencing lending decisions really up until the 1970s. And if we draw back and we look at all of Cuyahoga County and see those areas which were basically barred from lending, that critical faucet of capital was completely turned off. They were starved from investment. We see a lot of the city was basically excluded. Now, those areas in white on the map in 1940, many of those would become your new suburbs. And those would be open to creditors, those would be open to lending as long as they remained segregated, meeting many of the FHA guidelines of the time period. So what we did with this information was not only peer through the notes and really get into the minds of real estate professionals in the 1930s, but also try to answer some of the theories that were put forth. Just as the article in the Case for Reparations make, there's been a lot of conceptual thought in some historical research on the effects of redlining. Nobody's really looked at it in a quantitative way. And we do a lot of mapping stuff, and we say, oh, wait, these are actual just maps. Let's just overlay these areas over top of traditional areas of the city today, or excuse me, contemporary areas in the city today, and see what happens. Do the theories about what happened to the built environment add up? Is segregation still occurring in redlined areas? Were these the areas where all the subprime loans were going, as many have theorized? And this is what we did. And in our report, we exhaustively go through a lot of this material. And I think you'll find some really great research within there. And again, I'll credit Mr. Martin over there who does all the technically smart stuff I can't figure out with the data and the GIS. What we see first off is that the patterns of racial segregation in 2012, and that's the green dots there on the map showing just where the African American community lives in 2012, still parallel and mirror many of the traditionally redlined areas. And so as a legacy effect, we can certainly draw this straight line from who was redlined and where folks have been able to buy and live since then. Another big theory put forth after the housing crisis, and data here showed it to be very relevant, was that those neighborhoods which were redlined became prey for predatory lenders. And what you see overlaid on top of the redline map now would be 3 years of subprime lending data from 2004 up to 2006, right before the crisis hit. And what I can tell you is that in those neighborhoods that were redlined, 54% of the loans made during that time period were subprime loans, compared to a 15% subprime lending rate in the non-redlined areas, especially those areas that were identified as green or blue back in the old days. Redline maps also then helped guide other land uses that we didn't quite know what to do with or nobody wanted, right? So then kind of looking at the redlining map in comparison to where toxic waste release sites are today in Cuyahoga County, you see this relationship. Looking at lead poisoning. Again, another theory that for the first time we actually were able to use data to document. And this makes a lot of sense, right? That we would see the higher rates of lead exposure in these redlined areas because how do you remediate lead paint? You need money. You need home sales. You need mortgages. You need people turning over properties and rehabbing them. Well, if you don't do that for 40 or 50 years, you're going to be dealing with environmental blight issues like this for a very long time. Finally, going back to where I started today with infant mortality. And this is a deeper dive of some of that data. And what you see here, those white circles illustrate the infant mortality rate, the actual rate within neighborhoods across Cuyahoga County. And again, we see this direct relationship between history, what happened in those redlined areas, and contemporary health issues like infant mortality today. So if you lived in a neighborhood that was given an A rating back in 1940, today's infant mortality rate in your neighborhood is 2 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. If you lived in one of those neighborhoods that were graded yellow or red, your infant mortality rate would be 5 to 6 times that today in that neighborhood. And this is the long-term effect of neighborhoods or environments that were deprived of resources for so long, creating stressful situations where folks today are dealing with contemporary health problems because of the stressors in those communities. Again, just looking at that infant mortality hotspot map I showed you earlier in the past redlining patterns. One last bit of data which is documented in the report, and this is great work that Cuyahoga County Public Health has done in looking at life expectancy across neighborhoods. And again, just like all these other negative health outcomes, we see a life expectancy gap between those neighborhoods that were redlined and not redlined. And depending on which neighborhood categories you're measuring, a gap of anywhere from 10 to up to 15 years between communities. So why have I walked you through all this history? What I want to share with you today is that there are 3 very important things to come out of this as we look forward, as we think about restoring investment back into communities, as we hopefully see the continued revival and renaissance of Cleveland. First, that our values influence our policy, and we sometimes forget that. And so these policies that we look at as kind of just historical things that we don't think about what drove the decisions, the values of that day, which was racial exclusion, social exclusion, discrimination as a norm, were apparent in all those policies. And therefore, the outcomes of those policies reflect that. The question that we have to ask is, looking forward, what are our values today and how are they reflected in our policies? Second, when we look at challenges like this in neighborhoods, we have to respect the longevity of the challenge. I get very frustrated when I talk to funders who say, well, we're going to fund this program for 2 years, 3 years, and we'll fix the neighborhood. I hear this all the time, I'm telling you. So, and what I like to say, and what I'm really advocating for is that this is something that took 40 or 50 years. We need a sustained commitment to these neighborhoods to restore investment for at least a decade. And we need to stick to it. And we need to not expect immediate results, which is hard for funders to hear. But finally, the last point I want to say is that there's nothing natural about the challenges that we see. We have to divorce people of this fatalism that they get sometimes about neighborhoods that they work within, or that they maybe don't even have experience with, but they just say, well, that neighborhood's always been like that. These conditions were created by design. These neighborhoods were designed to fail, and if we did that with policy, we can fix them with policy. So I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you. Please go up to our website or the PlaceMatters website to pull down the report. And thank you again for your time today.
And thank you. I'm Rick Jackson from IdeaStream. Thanks for coming out today. It's kind of nice. I'm usually up here for a debate, and now we're all on the same side. It's kind of fun. The introduction in the City Club announcement says it best. In order to understand how zip codes became such a prominent social predictor, we need to examine the past. Why and how Greater Cleveland is divided as it is today, with people of wealth isolated in some areas, different races or ethnic subdivisions and other similar divisions, largely because they were designed that way, as Jason pointed out, 60 years ago or more, and they haven't changed. Don't blame the river. A lot of people want to blame the river. It's a choice people made. It's not a true geographical boundary. We often fool ourselves into believing that. I got to tell you, the Hope Memorial was completed back in 1932. The Detroit Superior was already a teenager, so crossing the river was not a problem. We now know that some city parcels were purposely created. Some remain as they were, though the original reasons don't. What he showed us today has laid out much of that history, and that background enables us to move forward with this conversation now, looking at the present and the future of this city that we love through the veil of the past. Let's reintroduce the panel. You know Jason Reece. He's the Director of Research at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. I'm going to apologize for him, though, because he said something that it hurts, even though it's 20 years later. He used the phrase, "I'm going to leave Cleveland and move to the city of Baltimore." You don't say that here.
Fatal flaw.
You use
Fatal
those
flaw.
words. My goodness. I thought somebody was going to hit him.
I had to bring out the emotion.
Okay. I hope it didn't embarrass you. Brian Smedley is a Ph.D. He's co-founder and executive director at National Collaborative for Health Equity. Come on up, gentlemen. And Freddy Collier, Jr. is the director of city planning for the city of Cleveland. So let's give them a nice round of applause as they come up. Rules of the game are pretty much that I will talk with these gentlemen. We'll have an open, wonderful, free-flowing conversation here for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will turn the floor over to you for, I'll moderate that as well, but we'll have questions from you for roughly that same period of time. We're going to try and go ahead and, sir, you're blocking the television camera. They don't want you to do that. And we'll go ahead and do that until roughly 4 o'clock or so, but if you're still going, I mean, these gentlemen are good to go. I mean, you came all the way from Washington, right? Might as well be here for a while. So let's get started. I'm going to give Jason a chance to rest and not throw you the first question, if that's okay. Freddie, City of Cleveland, I think, bears some but not all the responsibility for making change happen. You've been tasked with trying to lead us in making change happen. Give us a thumbnail for where we are right now and trying to look out there and say, these are problems, these are fixes.
Well, I have to be 100% candid. There's no panacea. The issues that Jason laid out are very complex. And before I give my answer, I just want to provide a little context. And for what I'm about to say, I hope I have a job tomorrow, but I have to say it. One of the things that we have to understand is that we talk about the proposition of values. And a lot of our policies have been driven by a supremacist value system. And part of the work that we're doing here locally, and this is just not local work, this is national, is we're coming back with an equity agenda. So we're trying to push back against that value proposition of supremacy. And the battleground is the policy arena, economics, entertainment, and the list goes on and on. So our societal structures is where we're going to have to infuse this equity agenda. Regarding Cleveland, Jason illuminated a lot of issues that many of us have experienced and lived through. I think for us at the City of Cleveland, one of the things that we're focused on is really looking at sort of how investment is happening today. And for those of you who know Cleveland, it's evident what's going on in downtown. It's evident what's going on in University Circle. And those are always sort of the bright spots that we tend to talk about. The dichotomy is that those neighborhoods are flanked by some of the most challenged communities in our city. Now, the administration takes a lot of heat for this perception that we are focused in the downtown and University Circle solely. That is not accurate. The fact of the matter is that the investments that you see in downtown and in University Circle are generally privately driven investments. The administration's position has always been about equity and community economic development. Our focus has been figuring out how do we tie the Buckeyes, the Fairfaxes, the Glenvilles, the Centrals to the investments that are happening in some of those epicenters of growth that I just talked about. So how do you do that? We take a three-pronged approach. 1, through programmatic resources, 2, through physical development, and 3, through economic opportunity. That's the only way those bridges can be developed. One of the things that most recently happened was $100 million the city drew down in bonds in order to really focus on some of the things that you're talking about. The mayor, who has been focused on neighborhoods, is going to use a quarter of those dollars to strategically target neighborhoods of need, namely some of the neighborhoods that I just named that flank those investment zones. What that's known as is a core redevelopment strategy. because it was the core that was disinvested in. It's the core that has to be reestablished. The question is, reestablished by who and who benefits? So these are all sort of legitimate approaches. The question is going to really lie in how effective are these approaches. Now, I can sit here and give you strategy all day, but again, as Jason alluded, the result is going to be long-term and systemic. It's not about political terms. It's not about individual accolades, but the story really is going to manifest itself as to how well our people are in communities. And this is why the health prospect is so important. The reason why the health agenda is a big deal for Cuyahoga County PlaceMatters in particular is because it begins to illuminate that structural racism actually exists. You can't escape it. So part of our focus is really about how do we use human impact as the ultimate metric for how well we do community. So that's sort of in a nutshell.
Hearing a lot of support from the audience out there, and you'll get your chance because I know a lot of you want to dig deep on these topics. Since he brought up the whole idea of health, he brought up a lot of ideas. But the idea of health, when we looked at that infant mortality chart that he put up there was some gasp in the room. The idea that 2 babies die here, and not 5 die here, but 5 times die here. And you see that not just in mortality, but in disease, in health, in obesity, in nutrition. It's frightening.
Absolutely, Rick. First, let me just thank the City Club and the Cuyahoga County PlaceMatters team for having me here. This has been a wonderful forum. Why does health equity matter? It matters for a lot of reasons, and I think you saw very starkly in the data that Jason laid out that we as a nation simply cannot afford to marginalize and isolate communities of color as we have. It's bad for health. It's bad for the economic prospects of people who live in those communities. And so in PlaceMatters, what we try to do is address and undo these bad policy decisions. As Jason said, these were very deliberate, conscious acts, and in the same fashion, we can undo them. How do we do that? There are a couple of different ways that we are arguing that we need to begin to look at, particularly at the local level, because a lot of the policy action is local. One, we can make place-based investments, right? Many of these communities were very deliberately excluded from economic opportunity. They were disinvested. We can do things like encouraging economic activity in these communities by establishing zones where economic activity is stimulated through tax reform, that kind of thing. We can encourage communities to have grocery stores, supermarkets in those areas, again, through tax incentives that allow those grocers and vendors to come into neighborhoods selling healthy products. We can clean up neighborhoods that have suffered from environmental degradation. So all of these are place-based strategies that help to make a community more livable, more vibrant economically. But we can also invest in the people in these communities. And we know from a large body of research evidence that things like investing in high-quality early childhood education provides lifelong benefits for kids, particularly in vulnerable communities who come out of difficult circumstances. Kids who in the early Head Start studies were exposed to an early childhood curriculum had much better outcomes as adults, better educational outcomes, better health status, better employment, less involvement in criminal justice systems. So all of these things matter. But I would also argue that another people-based strategy is housing mobility. So one of the things that is encouraging to see around the country is that communities are trying to take steps to desegregate our communities, both in terms of race and economic status. So the very deliberate strategies of the federal government and state and local housing authorities to concentrate public housing in low-income neighborhoods was a very bad strategy. There are efforts to undo that. Using existing housing voucher programs and other housing assistance to help people to move into neighborhoods with better opportunity structures, better schools, better job opportunities for their parents. But I'd argue that we have to do both at the same time, both place-based and people-based investments, because we see what happens when you do one without the other. If you make a community nice, guess what happens? People get forced out, the rents go up. We argue that housing mobility ought to include the ability for people to stay in a community that's transforming and improving both in terms of conditions for health and economic conditions. That way the people who've been there, sometimes for generations, can reap the benefits of those changes in their community.
I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to hear the Sound of Ideas this morning on 90.3. Jason was the guest, and toward the end of the program, that exact idea came up. We make an area nice, and then wealthier people want to move in, and those who've been there get forced out. Jason, that conversation really could have gone a lot of ways, but you have seen that happening before. How do we keep that from happening?
Yeah, it comes back to our values. If we redevelop neighborhoods, we know what the market's going to do. It's going to drive folks out eventually. It may take 20 years, it may happen in 5 years, but it's going to happen. The question becomes, how do you align policy so that you keep that place a community that's open to all? How do you align code enforcement so that the senior who has a code violation is not chased out of their house, but actually gets the help they need? How do you make sure that if there's jobs coming into those communities, they actually go to folks who live in those neighborhoods and need the economic help? From a policy standpoint, I can tell you it's challenging, but it's not rocket science. We have lots of tools that do it. It takes the commitment and the foresight to get ahead of the curve and do that. And in many ways, it makes us have to think forward and envision a different community. One of the challenges that we have is that we wait till the community improves and then we say, uh-oh, got to put some affordable housing in there. But then it's too late. You've lost your chance. It's being strategic and saying, you know what, I'm going to hold these parcels for the next 15 years because I know what's going to happen in this community.
Kind of interesting that the conversation this morning had centered because a caller called from Tremont, but it's happening in other places. Look at the expansion of the Cleveland Clinic and what's happening in Huff and on Fairfax on either side of that. How does the city step in and say, well, yeah, there's great development happening in Huff now. Let's not do what he just said, go too far before we try and shoehorn something in there.
Well, I think it's important too that people understand sort of what's actually happening. And there's not a great deal of promotion about the things that are going on in neighborhoods and with policy here currently.
Here's your chance.
And here's some of the things. I brought a list. I think my boss will be proud of me.
That was not set up.
So, yeah. So there's a couple of things. There's things like the low-income housing tax credit program that are being applied right here in the city of Cleveland. And basically that's a federal subsidy. Really that's designed to really make low-income housing affordable and worth the investment to developers, okay? And there's tax credits associated with that, and that's happening right here. There's community benefits agreements that this administration has really been aggressive in taking on, particularly around the Upper Chester development. And also we have a community benefits agreement around the Opportunity Corridor. So there's quite a bit of things that are happening in that respect. The other thing that is really critical is we have one of the city's oldest land banks. And we have an issue in the city of Cleveland and many other metropolitan areas are dealing with the issue of vacant land as a result of the foreclosure crisis and homes being demolished. Now, the land bank program is one that allows people to be able to purchase property, either a side yard next to them or other properties at a very low cost for redevelopment or reinvestment. But one of the things I want to say, about some of these programs that are going on, you have to be careful. And this is where the whole equity conversation comes into play. Even with a program that's designed for opportunity, it can be manipulated in a way that steers it toward one group and disadvantages another. So part of when we talk about like our land bank strategy, or we look at vacant land reuse, there are people who have been living under dire conditions for a number of years dealing with this issue, but may not have access or awareness about their ability to access these opportunities. So how do we begin to raise that awareness and create that level of communication? These are things that are all very important factors. You talk about areas like, say, for example, Fairfax, Huff. The Cleveland Foundation has initiated the Greater University Circle initiative. Now that's two-pronged. Well, one, it begins to create opportunities for people to work right next door to where they live. So it's that part of it. But the other piece of it is really trying to create various housing price points in those neighborhoods to create a pathway for individuals who can actually buy homes at an affordable rate, but also provide opportunities for the surgeon at the clinic who can buy a much more expensive property. And these are happening in these neighborhoods. And again, this is not an overnight prospect. This is the long game. And oftentimes people get impatient because they don't see things moving rapidly enough, right? But the reality is that it is moving. And we're not there yet. So I don't want to paint a picture as if we got it under control, because we don't. But we are on a trajectory that I think the administration has made very clear and our partners have made very clear. Many of them are fighting day to day, and they exist in this room. So I think one of the most important things that needs to happen here at the local level is, one, understanding this history and allowing it to get into your psyche and into your spirit so that you can confront these things when they're in front of you in the work that all of us that are in this room are doing. Because there's many partners in this room right now that are addressing the issues that he has laid out. But the challenge is, how do we know we're successful? And what does success looks like? And I think that's really what we all have to kind of come together and determine for ourselves. Is it population growth? Is it a higher educated population living in the city? It's a number of different things. And I think that has to be defined. And I think that has yet to be defined.
All good things to have, though. Jason, I know that the Kirwan Institute has looked at other cities, Toledo, for instance. Are we cutting edge here in trying to do the things we're trying to do with the partners in the room he's already mentioned? Or are other cities ahead of us? And are there success stories we can point to and say, this works for Cleveland, this works for Cleveland, let's leave that alone?
I'd argue you're cutting edge. I mean, you have 200 people that came out today, this afternoon, to talk about the legacy of redlining, the importance of equity to support health in this community. You have the infrastructure that's occurred because of the PlaceMatters team in years of building capacity around these issues. And so trust me that I go to other communities and I share Cleveland's story with them. And so you should be proud of the work that you're doing. But this is a long road, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take collective effort. So all of the stakeholders engaged here, all the different organizations are going to have to be part of this long-term strategy to see the prosperity that we anticipate to come.
You mentioned redlining there. The whole idea of redlining is gone is one thing. A lot of people think, okay, that's in the past. But you were saying this morning, economically, we still see some of that because banks or insurance companies still don't want to lend, still don't want to insure in certain zip codes.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked some about insurance this morning on the radio, challenges with insurance redlining, which is a very tricky area to regulate. And this extends not only to home insurance, but also auto insurance. But also a very troubling thing that we've seen is that after the subprime lending period, we've seen banks really withdraw credit, tighten credit markets. And we've just started, and haven't done it in Cleveland, but we just started looking at this in Columbus to say, well, where are the more recent loans going? And we're starting to see that another era of redlining is occurring in many of those neighborhoods that were pummeled with subprime loans earlier. And so this is a concern that, again, we have to think very proactively about credit. We have to think about models for supporting home ownership. And we have to get partners on board from the financial sector who will still invest in those communities.
Brian, you had spoken about the whole idea of raising awareness. But a billboard or two, a spot on the TV news isn't really going to work. Even going into our churches doesn't have the impact it used to have. So where do we go?
Well, we've got to build a movement. Obviously, we need the political push from a large movement, a constituency of people who demand equity. We need to help people understand that our fates are truly deeply intertwined here, particularly with demographic change, with the increase in the proportion of people of color in the United States. Increasingly, young people of color are going to define our economic security, our ability to compete internationally. And increasingly, the nation's health status is reflecting the health status of people of color. So again, we can't afford to allow some communities to be marginalized and left behind from a health or an economic standpoint. So we try to argue that building this movement takes everybody engaged here, right? Everybody who's come to this event, by definition, is in this movement, whether you agree with everything that we discuss or not. But the leadership in communities like Cleveland is so inspiring. You asked the question about where does Cleveland rank? Through the National Collaborative for Health Equity, we run a National PlaceMatters initiative. We have 19 teams around the country. I can tell you that Cuyahoga County is a shining light, considering all of the challenges that Northeast Ohio faced. I'm from Detroit. I understand Rust Belt cities.
Gotcha.
It is a real challenge, but to see the work that's going on here and the leadership that you have here is incredibly inspiring. I see a movement happening here that's gaining traction, and I can tell you in a lot of other communities you don't see this kind of energy, but it has to be built at the local level because a lot of the policy strategies and solutions are local strategies.
Freddie, we talk about the whole idea of diversity, and we want to bring people of color into areas that don't have color right now. We want to try and stop urban sprawl because in many cases that was a result. Do we also need to bring the majority back into minority communities? Can we?
Yes, it's happening. When you think about, take for example, I think I've seen Councilman Simperman here. You think about communities like Tremont. You think about the interest that is now being focused on by certain populations in the urban core, wanting to reestablish community, being tired of driving for miles home in the evening tired because some people want it to be separate. So what you're seeing is this shifting of wanting to come back to the urban core, being able to walk to the grocery store, being able to walk to work. So this idea of sustainable neighborhoods, where you have the things in proximity to you that you need to access on a daily basis. There are folks who have abandoned the urban core who miss that, and they want that back. The question is, we have to ensure that it's not a flip-flop situation, but it's a situation where when we establish community and we begin to restore value in the community, that those individuals who had to live in that neighborhood under dire circumstances should not be shipped out. Now there's another aspect to that, and this is one where the onus is on the community. Many of us who have grown up in neighborhoods where there were significant challenges, our goal was to get an education, get a good job, and get out. That was the mindset. And there was a sense of accomplishment associated with assimilation. And when I say associated with assimilation, I mean the big house, the 2 cars, and that American dream that is really no longer existing. So part of what we have to do is establish ourselves in community. Don't run. And I'm not accusing any individual who has taken advantage of economic opportunities, who want decent schools for their kids and all of that. I'm not knocking that. Right. But what we're saying is that if you don't establish community, you're going to lose social cohesion, you're going to lose your identity, you're going to lose all of those things that really create place. And it's hard to come back and reestablish yourself. So I think part of what we all need to do, and Cleveland is a poster child for this, Cleveland has the proposition of value on its side. You can live in this city at a very moderate income and live a very decent lifestyle, unlike any other place in this country. Richie Perperian from the Center for Population Dynamics actually did a study on population in migration. And one of the things that was found was that our greatest population, or in-migration of population, was from Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, New York. People from Brooklyn, high density, high cost area, are looking to say, you know what, I can live here affordably and I can eat. So this is part of
Eat?
Yeah, literally. But literally having that value proposition as one of our hallmarks to really drawing people back to the city, because people are tired of posturing and paying for the McMansion and spending $100 on gas just to get back and forth.
Do you need pioneers to do this? People to come in and say, I don't need to live in, I'm not going to pick on a place, but I don't need to live in Avon anymore. I can live in Tremont?
People have already pioneered. It's already, that's already started, and I think you're going to always have individuals who want to be separate, and they will go to great lengths, including self-inflicted financial pain, to remain separate. But part of what I think is happening that we're continuing to leverage, and the administration is continuing to leverage, is really building off of where those core areas are that people are deciding to move. The mayor always alluded to this idea of creating neighborhoods of choice, creating neighborhoods where people decide to live, where we don't have to prostitute ourselves to get them to come back.
Help me out, folks. What's the neighborhood Sherrod Brown moved back into? Yeah, thank you, Warren Attorney. Do we need more examples like that where the city, something new popped in the middle of something old and now the whole area is growing because of that? Can Cleveland make that happen here and here and here and here?
It could, and I think it's a regenerative approach. And when I say regenerative approach, is that there has to be an anchor, there has to be something that you can build off of, and there has to be resources where that are invested in a place that you can leverage. And this is why I always allude to our core redevelopment strategy. You look at downtown, you look at University Circle, you look at the Opportunity Corridor, you look at Euclid Corridor, the Cuyahoga River Valley, our lakefront. Those areas have to succeed for us to become the city that we want to see. It's not a either or prospect, it's a both and. And when you look at how those areas are growing, that's important because without those areas, our tax base hurts, okay, and that hurts everybody's prospect. The question, the battleground, let me take that back, I'm not gonna say battleground, but the areas that we have to focus on are the fringes, those neighborhoods that flank those investment areas. And how do we make those connections? If we can successfully do that, Cleveland will regenerate itself. And I think it can be done in an equitable way. But it won't be because people are nice, because at the end of the day, it's really about this dichotomy of people versus profit. And when you look at investment decisions that have been made on our waterfront, it was profit driven. It wasn't people driven. The waterfront is God's gift to our community, and everybody, regardless of their income, should be able to access it. But when you look at some of our past practices, when we talk about downtown development, where you have I-90 on our waterfront, you have bedroom communities that carve out their space on our 8 miles of waterfront. But then you look at a city like Chicago, where you have this contiguous public space that anybody could access. Crossing Lakeshore Boulevard, being able to walk. Those types of activities and development actions are the result of principles that were followed, values that were followed, that manifest themselves in the physical environment. And you look at the city of Cleveland and you see our history, and part of what we're trying to do right now in planning is really course correct. That's what we're doing. And I think that's one of the great things about planning. As technology changes and as conditions change, you're going to always need to account for it. So it just keeps us employed, I guess.
Okay. Good place to take a break. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Barbara Danforth for a moment, and when we come back, it's up to you for questions.
Thank you. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying an excellent panel discussion titled History Matters, Understanding the Role of Policy, Race, and Real Estate in Cuyahoga County, featuring Freddy L. Collier, Jr., Director of Planning for the City of Cleveland, Jason Reece, Director of Research for the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, and Dr. Brian Smedley, co-founder and executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. Our moderator this afternoon has been Rick Jackson, host and producer of WCPN's Morning Edition. We encourage you now to formulate questions for our panelists and remind you that your questions should be brief, to the point, and questions. Be sure to tune in to our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and the country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our community partners for today's program are Cuyahoga County PlaceMatters and the Cleveland Municipal Housing Court. We thank you both for your support. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by the Cleveland Municipal Housing Court, Cuyahoga County Board of Health, Policy Bridge, Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods at Case Western Reserve University, and the Sisters of Charity Foundation of Cleveland. We certainly thank you very much for your support. We welcome students today at today's program from Richmond Heights Secondary School, Shaker Heights High School, and St. Martin's DePore High School. Students, would you raise your hands? Students? Student participation is made possible by a generous grant from Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. We thank you for your support. This Friday, February 20th, the City Club welcomes Joseph Demarest, Jr., Assistant Director of the FBI's Cyber Division, and a panel of experts to discuss cybersecurity issues. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Now, we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky. First question, please.
First, thank you for that well thought out and well researched presentation. I'm a funeral director by profession, and my family business was a victim of redlining. And now this was in the 70s, the 80s, and into the early 90s. I saw the frustration on my father's face as he tried to get a loan to expand our family business. But it wasn't until the City of Cleveland brought the City of Cleveland's Empowerment Zone program, a $100 million program, federal program. So as I looked at the problems, the way you laid them out, the solutions really were just to do exactly what they did 100 years ago. Absolutely. And the City of Cleveland's Empowerment Zone greenlined, if you want to call it redlining, they greenlined communities and said we're going to invest money. And if we put monies into a bank, then you should loan in these communities. And Mayor Michael R. White used his leverage and influence to make that happen. And to your point, the problem was it was only a 10-year program. And they didn't invest long enough. They just stopped after 10 years. They got another 4 years out of it. But my question is, what can you do as an advocate to influence those needed changes at the federal level to make a difference?
I would just note that the Obama administration has initiated several major federal initiatives, place-based initiatives, to do exactly that. Promise Neighborhoods is an effort to help encourage economic activity. Choice Neighborhoods links education reform with housing mobility options. And then the Promise Zones program is a relatively new program. Initially, Promise Zones grants were open to communities that had received a Choice Neighborhoods or Promise Neighborhoods grant or other place-based grant funding. But the idea is the same. Stimulate economic activity, reverse the effects of redlining through conscious and deliberate policymaking decisions. The goals are to increase economic activity, reduce crime, to give kids better educational opportunities, and to improve health. And we know that place is important, and conscious investments in all those areas are important. So I would encourage people who are interested to become engaged. I love the word that you use because it does take advocacy to support this work. One of the things that the administration needs is for Congress to pass a tax credit for Promise Zones neighborhoods so that that economic activity along with tax incentives can really revitalize communities. Now, I'm not here to be a cheerleader I'm just pointing out that these initiatives exist, but it's up to us to get on the phone, call our members of Congress, write to them, say we want this kind of legislation, we want these kinds of programs to come into our communities.
Brian, you mentioned all these different initiatives, and I'm sure a lot of people never heard of some of them. Is there a simple place we can go to find out what's available? What can I do from my neighborhood that maybe is already in place and I just don't know?
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things that the administration needs to do a better job of is helping to engage, particularly at the grassroots level, to let people know what kinds of initiatives they're trying to develop, and again, to encourage people to become politically engaged. The Department of Housing and Urban Development leads a lot of this work. They lead the Promise Zones work. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal HUD, and there'll be a link. I don't have the exact URL in my head, but there'll be a link to the Promise Zones initiative.
Good start. Teddy.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's been said that culture eats strategy every day for breakfast. So I would like each of you to think about a couple of things and respond. First of all, what has been the role of culture in this process that we've seen historically? And secondarily, what things do we need to understand about culture based on our history that we need to then address as we go forward trying to change the environment?
Let's just start with Freddie and go down the line.
Yeah, that's a interesting question. When we talk about culture, you're talking about how we talk about things, how we move, how we act, and how we approach things. And I think for a long period of time, I think throughout U.S. history and Cleveland's history, there was a certain type of culture of value proposition that permeated and that dictated the policies that Jason laid out. When you talk about culture change and systems change, you have to hit it at every level. When we talk about changing values, you have to first raise awareness. People need to be informed. And I think forums like this helps to illuminate things to people so they can walk away with a different perspective. And I know through the HIP-C process, for example, this idea of perspective transformation, that ideology is really important, is how do you get people to think differently so they can feel differently, and then they'll do differently. So the value proposition is key. Then that shifts down to the policy arena, right? If we're talking about changing our values, we start to think about how we approach public policy, and we do it with a level of sensitivity. The other thing is community mobilization. How do you get people to act and get people to enlist? And again, it all stems back to the value proposition. I like to use as an example, when Dr. King spoke at the March on Washington, and so many people came out. Even though he was a great orator, they didn't come out because he was just cold on the mic. They came out because of the idea of freedom, right? That idea. And people went, they heard, they were inspired, and then they went back to their communities and they dealt with the idea of freedom where they were. The issues that they were dealing with in Selma, Alabama was much different from the issues they were dealing with in New York City, but it was still based on racial segregation and all of these other cultural things that permeated through society. So there's no script. It's really about innovation. And the thing that makes something innovative is there's no model for it. So people have a challenge of creating. They have a problem creating. So part of what we have to do is, it's great to look at best practices. It's great to look at model policies, but we in Cleveland have to continue to put our heads together to think about what's relevant here and how can we creatively deal with our issues and challenges.
I so appreciate your question. I want to kind of extend what Freddie said and hit at a particular issue, which I think is what you are alluding to, which is the role of race and racism. Because we still are afraid to have these conversations. But as Jason's presentation shows in a very powerful way, race is the 800-pound elephant in the room. And it is exactly the racism that persists in this country that prevents us, I think, from building the kinds of political movements toward equity that we need. We know, for example, that that race and racism remains the subtext for too many policy decisions. So, for example, when states are thinking about whether or not to expand Medicaid, which states expanded? Typically, it's those states a little bit more progressive, and also notably states that in many cases have a smaller population of people of color. In the Deep South, none of the states have accepted the Medicaid expansion except Arkansas with their waiver. But this is just one example of a policy where race has remained the subtext, but we don't want to talk about it. So it's very clear that if we put into place policy decisions, even 60, 70 years ago, that are based on race, we can't undo those unless we continue to talk about the legacy of those kinds of decisions and the contemporary context in which racism operates today. Right. So appreciate your question.
To build upon both responses, and this is a great question, I think more about this dialogue around race and to also not be afraid of fleshing out conflicts around race and class, because they're going to happen. They're going to happen repeatedly. We we're working on a documentary down in Dayton on a successful effort to expand a transit line into a suburb outside of Dayton. And got lots of video of all these public meetings where the reasons stated for resisting this transit line were everything but race, right? There was the safety, oh, it didn't look pretty, we're gonna need cameras, oh wait, there's liability. When it comes down to it though, after everything gets addressed, there's still this resistance. And what is that resistance? That's this discomfort around race and class. And as advocates, we have to flesh that out. We have to bring that to the forefront and not be afraid to bring it to the forefront. And also for those people who want to shut down conversations when we bring out race, we have to push against that. And so I think that's one of the biggest fundamental changes. And you're going to see it time and time again as neighborhoods develop here. Little conflicts will break out over this development or that development. And if race is that subtext, we got to bring that to a forefront.
Good afternoon. I'm hoping my question builds on Greg Brown's as well. What, if anything, is the PlaceMatters team or any other work doing to promote the value proposition of equity? And I'm speaking specifically to actually a presenter that you had at your national conference last year, Richard Wilkinson, who's taking global World Health Organization data and making the point, in particular of the United States, of how our inequities are costing us hugely. And I think this has a lot to do with mindset, building on culture, and I want to just give a quick, may seem tangential example of where I live in East Cleveland. East Cleveland was founded by the wealthiest man in this country's history. And in a very short period of time, they didn't have any of these policies in place. In a very short period of time, because of mindset, fear, the neighborhood went from white to black, and probably people in this room know better than I do, 5 years, 10 years, and is now probably one of the poorest cities in the country and at risk of completely dissolving. And so I know policy played a smaller part, but in many ways it didn't. And I feel like East Cleveland is a case study for this country in terms of place and mindset and how powerfully mindset can even override policy if we're not addressing it. And so that's why my question about really bringing into our awareness the cost of white supremacy and the benefit of equity.
No, that's a great point. Richard Wilkinson's work shows that more inequitable societies, there are poor outcomes for everybody in those communities. So you have poorer health outcomes, a shortened life expectancy, less economic activity in nations and communities where you have greater inequality. So this is another reason why it's in our shared interest to advance an equity frame. PolicyLink is one of those organizations that does a great job of that, arguing that equity is the superior growth model. If we want to come out of an economic downturn, if we want to ensure that our communities are vibrant, that we're competitive internationally, equity is the only way to get there, particularly because we are becoming a more inequitable society along many measures. So your point is an excellent one. We got to somehow help the nation understand this interdependence that we have. But it is difficult, particularly when race becomes a subtext that people don't understand or are not consciously aware of. The Kirwan Institute every year puts out a fantastic report called The State of the Science on Implicit Bias. Implicit bias, just very briefly, is an area of study in psychological science where we can actually understand the biases that people are not consciously aware of. That the vast majority of the people in the United States, because of the way that we're socialized, harbor pro-white biases, anti-black biases, but there are also biases that we're often not consciously aware of along many other dimensions, such as heterosexist biases, ageist biases, gender-based biases. The point is, we all have these biases and stereotypes rattling around in our heads, even if we don't consciously endorse them. I would probably bet that everybody in this room is an egalitarian who believes in social justice. But the vast majority of us harbor biases and prejudices that we're not consciously aware of that are things that we act upon. And that relates to this question of political movements. If so many of us, if majorities of us, and some researchers argue that the vast majority of individuals socialized in the United States harbor these biases, what it means in terms of political movements, I think, is very daunting. It means that we can't get beyond, despite our best intentions, the reality that difference is scary for many people. So I so appreciate your question, because we gotta tie together our understanding and be much more sophisticated about how we build movements for equity, knowing that we're swimming upstream against a tide of biases and stereotypes that take us in the other direction.
Thank you.
So thank you. I want to highlight the fact that those communities that were unfairly redlined are still today communities where we have higher rates of unfair criminalization and incarceration of both adults and children, and point out the fact that Cuyahoga County has the highest percentage of people with criminal convictions in the state of Ohio and the highest number of people who are represented in Ohio's prisons. So tying all this together, what are some recommendations that you have to ensure that we atone for the unfair and continuous over-criminalization of communities of color in the city of Cleveland?
Is that for Dr. Smedley?
That's for everyone.
Well, you're going to get me in trouble. Pass.
Well, first, to go back to the value question, right? Are we a society where we're okay with permanently barring opportunities for the majority, in many cases, of men in some of these neighborhoods, which is the end result of a lot of these policies? Are we okay with using the criminal justice system as a default mental health system and public health system to deal with drug addiction? And can we educate ourselves that if we're going to deal with the economic issues in those communities, we have to deal with the linkage between our criminalization, the effect of folks having a felony on their record, and that even if they can get through the door, they're going to be highly less competitive than other job applicants, and their ability to basically bring home a living. And so we can talk all we want about jobs, but unless we bring this issue into our discussion, we're ultimately going to have some very serious challenges in the long run. And so, again, not to overly complicate all the bevy of issues that we've talked about today, but it has to be on the agenda, and it has to be one of those contemporary issues. When we do that audit of what do our values say today, how do those relate to our criminal justice policies?
Right. And I just want to point out that there's a huge economic component to that, because there's an economic dependency on the criminal justice system to incarcerate individuals, because there's a lot of profit that can be gained from that. So it's in some people's interest or some entities' interest to ensure that you keep the bodies flowing into and out of prison. And that's a bigger conversation that I think I don't have the answer to, but I think needs to be tackled, is really the economics behind the prison industrial complex.
I would just add that there are ways to help police and communities work better together. You're so right that aggressive policing in communities of color has been so detrimental for a host of reasons. But even just the kind of work that some are doing around implicit bias is being used in trainings with police departments to help them understand why is it that you react more forcefully with an African-American suspect versus a white suspect in identical circumstances. Using simulations, training, implicit bias becomes part of a way to help train police about their attitudes and behaviors toward communities of color, in addition to many other things that have to happen, including ensuring accountability to communities when police violate use of force guidelines. But these are promising beginnings.
Running close to the top of the hour, we'll have to make this the last question. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Juan, and I represent the Hispanic Alliance on the west side of Cleveland. And I'd like to commend and thank all of you for your insight and your very deep in the weeds comments that you have shared this afternoon. I was wondering, though, if you could maybe help us understand a little bit better how is it that we use cultural norms and folkways and things like language and those things that make unique communities unique, so that those are considered assets as opposed to how they had been filtered historically through dominant society as liabilities to the greater good. And so we're struggling with that today in the development of La Villa Hispana. Many of you, I hope, have heard about that. And so it's incumbent, I think, that we get experts like yourselves to understand the importance of things like tradition, culture, language, and all the things that make up a people. So I would be very helpful for us if you could give us some insight.
Great question. Let's start with Jason.
Well, just as you've stated, it's first changing our orientation to see that as an asset. Too much development policy is around what I refer to as bricks and sticks, right? We're going to fix up the built environment, we're going to make things pretty, and all that other good stuff will come along with it. It's a reorientation to say, actually, no, the culture of this place is one of the most fundamentally important assets of this community, and it's going to take a priority in our decision making as we think about that community. So that means it gets more investment, it gets more attention. And so that is one piece of it. It's doing that asset-based development. And to me, it goes back to some of what Freddie had stated. It's the realization that that aspect of culture is what makes place. Right? It's the intangible thing that we can't replicate.
Right.
There are a lot of kind of sterile, mixed-use developments that look really great, but you walk in and you feel it, right? You know, you're like, this is, I think I'm in Disneyland. That's an asset that you got to hold on to, and that's an asset that you need to support, because that could make or break a lot of the neighborhoods in the future. So it's something that can't be replicated.
And just briefly, in Place Matters, one of the things that we constantly stress is that there are sources of strength and resilience and leadership in every community. We couldn't be here today without that resiliency after what so many communities have been through. So clearly, there's a lot we can learn from these communities, and the other sort of tenet of this work is that communities themselves have to lead the work. It's their vision that we are working toward. And so by uplifting that, by saying that we cherish and value what these communities bring to the table, the vision that they have for what they want their community to look like, that's one of the ways that we can value all of those cultural dimensions.
And I'll be really brief. I think you have to be able to introduce that culture to the community and to the world. I mean, we have a lot of really great assets in Cleveland, a lot of ethnic enclaves, and a lot of really good stuff that's going on. And I think we have to be more thoughtful in how we display that to the larger city. When you think about, even if it's a venue, cultural venue or a restaurant, how do you introduce that to the community to get people to frequent your community and discover your community? And I think using sort of our anchor assets in our neighborhoods can be a really great draw to sort of introduce the culture that exists in a community like the one you referenced.
Freddie Collier, Brian Smedley, Jason Reece. Thank you all.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a panel discussion titled History Matters, Understanding the Role of Policy, Race, and Real Estate in Cuyahoga County. We thank the panelists and the moderator, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.